There's something strangely comforting about opening an old story, especially one that has been sitting quietly for thousands of years. The book of Jeremiah is one of those stories that many people think they know, but when you actually sit with it, you start noticing a very different heartbeat underneath the surface. Not loud, not dramatic, just this soft, aching voice calling from somewhere deep, saying, "Listen, there's more here than you think." And that's where our journey begins. When people hear the name Jeremiah, they imagine a prophet who is always sad, always warning, always talking about judgment. Almost like that one friend who only shows up to tell you bad news. But the truth is so much deeper. Jeremiah wasn't just a prophet of warnings. He was a prophet who felt everything with his whole chest. He carried the weight of a nation that refused to listen, and yet he never stopped loving them. That's what makes his story hit differently. Imagine being young, maybe in your teens, and suddenly God hands you a calling you never asked for. That was Jeremiah, a young boy from a priestly family, probably dreaming of a quiet life. And then one day, God interrupts everything with a voice that says, "Before I formed you, I knew you." Just think about that for a moment. Before Jeremiah even existed, God knew every tear he'd cry, every fear he'd fight, every sleepless night he'd endure. Still, he chose him. Jeremiah's first instinct? I'm too young. I can't speak. It sounds like us whenever life pushes us into something uncomfortable. We shrink. We doubt. We tell God we're not ready. We're not enough. But God didn't ask Jeremiah whether he felt ready. God simply said, "Go. I am with you." And that sets the tone for the entire book. Jeremiah's mission wasn't just to warn Israel about their destruction. It was to reveal God's heart, the heart of a father watching his children run straight towards danger with their hands over their ears. There's a hidden tenderness in every chapter, almost like God whispering, "Please come back. I don't want to lose you." One of the most powerful parts of Jeremiah's story is how honest he is. He doesn't pretend to be strong all the time. He doesn't hide his confusion or frustration. He talks to God like a real person, raw, unfiltered, emotional. At times he feels abandoned, other times overwhelmed, and sometimes he even asks God why he was chosen in the first place. But that's what makes his journey so relatable. Because haven't we all been there? Moments where life doesn't make sense. Moments where doing the right thing feels painful. Moments where obedience feels lonely. Jeremiah lived that life. People mocked him. His own hometown rejected him. Leaders hated him. At one point, he was thrown into a muddy pit and left to die. Imagine that, serving faithfully, speaking truth, doing exactly what God asked, and still ending up stuck in mud up to your waist, in the dark, cold, forgotten. If Jeremiah were sitting with us today, he'd probably say something like, "I didn't understand everything, but I trusted the one who asked me to speak." And that's where the hidden message starts shining through. Because beneath all the warnings and judgments, there's this steady thread of hope weaving through the book. It's like God keeps saying, "You've messed up, but it's not over. I'm not giving up on you." Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is the famous verse, the one everyone frames on their wall. "For I know the plans I have for you." But what most people don't realize is that this promise wasn't given in a peaceful moment. It wasn't given when everything was going right. God gave this promise while the people were in exile, when life was at its darkest, when their future looked broken, when they thought God had abandoned them. In other words, God's message wasn't, "I'll bless you once things improve." It was, "I'm still writing your story, even while everything is falling apart." And honestly, that hits home for a lot of us. We look at our lives, the delays, the closed doors, the disappointments, and we assume maybe God changed his mind. But Jeremiah's story tells you something completely different. God is working behind the scenes even when you think he's silent. Sometimes, he lets things collapse not to destroy you, but to rebuild you with a foundation that can't be shaken. Another hidden layer in Jeremiah's story is how deeply personal God's love is. In one chapter, God describes himself as a husband begging his unfaithful bride to come home. Not angrily, but with heartbreak. That's not the language of a God who wants to punish. That's the language of a God who wants to restore. Jeremiah reveals a God who feels, a God who waits, a God who pursues, a God who refuses to give up. Even when people completely turn their backs on him, God kept sending Jeremiah to remind them, I'm still here. That's the message many of us need today, because sometimes we feel too far gone, too broken, too messed up to come back. But God doesn't see us that way. He sees us the way he saw Israel. Lost, yes, but still worth saving. Now, let's talk about something people usually miss. Jeremiah wasn't just a prophet. He was also a mirror. He reflected the emotional weight God carried. He reflected the stubbornness of the people. He reflected the hope of the future. Jeremiah's tears weren't just his own. They were God's tears too. That's why he's called the weeping prophet, not because he was weak, but because he carried love so deeply that he couldn't stay silent. And in today's world, where everyone wants to appear strong, polished, perfect, Jeremiah teaches us that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is feel,
to care, to cry,
to love even when loving hurts. One of the most profound hidden messages of Jeremiah is this: obedience doesn't guarantee an easy life, but it guarantees a meaningful one. Jeremiah didn't see immediate results. Most people ignored him. The nation still fell. Exile still came. But what Jeremiah didn't see in his lifetime was how his message would shape the world for generations. His words would later inspire Daniel in Babylon. His message would point toward the new covenant, the promise of a Savior who would write God's laws on our hearts instead of stone tablets. Jeremiah's obedience planted seeds that grew long after he was gone. And maybe that's something you need to hear too. Not everything God calls you to do will show fruit immediately, but it will matter. Sometimes God uses your obedience to heal someone years from now. Sometimes your faith becomes the reason someone else finds hope later. The book of Jeremiah also reveals how God handles broken people. He doesn't throw them away. He reshapes them. Remember the story of the potter? God tells Jeremiah to go watch a potter molding clay. As the potter shapes the vessel, it gets ruined in his hands. But instead of tossing the clay aside, the potter reshapes it into something new. And God says, "This is how I deal with you." That's one of the most healing truths in the entire Bible. You're not too ruined. You're not too far gone. Your story isn't over. God doesn't discard you. He rebuilds you. Jeremiah teaches us that God is a potter who never throws his clay away. As the book unfolds, it becomes clear that the real enemy wasn't Babylon. It wasn't the kings. It wasn't the false prophets. The real enemy was the people's stubbornness, their refusal to listen. And yet, even with their stubborn hearts, God's final message wasn't destruction. It was restoration. God promises they will return home. He promises he will bring healing. He promises a new covenant, something better, deeper, permanent. And that's where we finally see the hidden message shining like a light. God's love is louder than his judgment. His mercy is stronger than our rebellion. His plans are bigger than our failures. Jeremiah's story is a reminder that no matter how far you drift, God is still calling you home. No matter how lost you feel, there is a path leading back. And no matter how broken you think you are, God still sees the future he planned for you. That's the Jeremiah most people never meet, the prophet who reveals God's relentless love. And maybe, somehow, in a quiet way, his message is for you too. There's something almost haunting about Jeremiah's story. Not in a scary way, but in that quiet, lingering kind of way that stays with you long after you read it. When you step into the book of Jeremiah, you don't just see history. You feel a human heart beating between the lines. And the more you listen, the more you realize this isn't just a prophet talking, it's God trying to reach a stubborn people who kept drifting further away. But today, we're not looking at the usual warnings or judgments. We're digging into the hidden layers, the part most people skip over without noticing. Because Jeremiah isn't just a story about a nation collapsing. It's a story about a God who refuses to let go. Let's rewind to the beginning. Not a palace, not a battlefield, but a small town called Anathoth. That's where Jeremiah grew up. Quiet place, nothing glamorous. You almost imagine narrow, dusty roads, kids running around, the smell of fresh bread coming from clay ovens. Just a normal, peaceful life. Jeremiah probably thought he'd follow his father's footsteps and become a priest. Simple, predictable, safe. But God had different plans. One ordinary day, everything shifts. God calls out to this young boy, maybe a teenager, and tells him something that would shake anyone's soul. I chose you before you were born. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. It's almost overwhelming. Imagine hearing that when you're barely old enough to understand who you are. Jeremiah reacts the same way any of us would. I can't do this. I'm too young. I'm not ready. But God doesn't back off. He touches Jeremiah's mouth and says, I've put my words in you. Not I might help you. Not let's try. But it's already done. That moment sets the whole tone of the book. Jeremiah's calling wasn't built on confidence. It was built on God's presence. And honestly, that's something we all need to hear sometimes. Because most of us step into life with trembling hands, wondering if we're enough. But God doesn't choose us because we're strong. He chooses us so He can make us strong. As Jeremiah steps into his calling, he doesn't enter a world eager to listen. He walks into a nation drifting further away from God every day. People were worshiping idols, trusting fake prophets, and pretending everything was fine even though spiritually, everything was falling apart. Jeremiah becomes this lone voice standing in the middle of chaos, saying, Please listen. You're going the wrong way. But instead of changing, the people attack him. Leaders call him a liar. Priests call him a traitor. His neighbors plot to kill him. And through all of this, Jeremiah keeps speaking because he knows the message isn't his. It's God's. One of the hidden gems in Jeremiah's story is how emotionally honest he is. He doesn't hide his fear or pretend to be brave. Several times, he breaks down in tears. He asks God why he was chosen for such a painful task. He even says at one point, I wish I had never been born. It's heavy.
Raw. Real.
And that's exactly why his story feels so human. Jeremiah loved his people deeply. Every warning he spoke came from love, not anger. He didn't want destruction. He wanted them to wake up before it was too late. You see, most people read the book of Jeremiah and think it's only about judgment. But if you listen closely, there's this soft, aching melody underneath, God's heartbreak. Every chapter carries this quiet whisper, Come back to me. Please come back. Jeremiah becomes the voice God uses to express his grief, his longing, his hope. That's why Jeremiah is sometimes called the prophet of the broken heart. But there's another angle people rarely notice. Jeremiah wasn't just carrying his own pain. He was carrying God's feelings too. One of the most beautiful scenes in the book is when God tells Jeremiah to go to a potter's house. Jeremiah walks in, sees the potter shaping clay on a wheel. The clay collapses in his hands. It's ruined, but the potter doesn't throw it away. He reshapes it into something new. And then God says, This is how I work. That moment reveals the entire heart of Jeremiah's message. God doesn't give up on broken things. He rebuilds them. Even when the people ruined themselves with disobedience, God wasn't looking for a reason to destroy them. He was looking for a way to remake them. And that's something incredibly healing. Because if you've lived long enough, you know what it feels like to break. Maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. You know those moments where something in you collapses? A prayer that wasn't answered, a relationship that fell apart, a dream that died quietly behind your ribs. Jeremiah's story tells you, God can reshape what life tried to ruin. He can rebuild what you thought was lost forever. You're clay in the hands of a potter who never throws anyone away. Another hidden message appears in the chapters where Jeremiah talks about false prophets. These men were telling the people, everything's fine. No need to worry. Their words sounded sweet, comforting, easy. Jeremiah's words were harder, but true. And that teaches something important. Not everything comforting is true. Not everything true is comfortable. Real transformation often starts with uncomfortable truth, the kind that wakes you up rather than puts you to sleep. Jeremiah keeps pleading with the people. Turn back now. There's still time. But they ignore him again and again. Eventually, the destruction he warned about finally happens. Jerusalem falls. The temple burns. Families are taken into exile. But even then, even at the darkest moment, the message doesn't end in sadness. Because this is when Jeremiah delivers one of the most hopeful promises in the entire Bible. The same God who watched them fall says, "I will bring you back. I will restore you. I will give you a future and a hope." And here's the twist most people miss. God said this during their exile, not after. In other words, God speaks hope in the very moment you feel hopeless. He speaks future when you can't see one. He speaks restoration when everything looks ruined. Jeremiah teaches us that God's love doesn't wait for you to fix yourself. It meets you in your brokenness. It sits with you in your confusion. It holds you when you feel far away. And maybe that's the part of Jeremiah we need the most today. Because there are days when life feels like exile. Days where you're physically present, but emotionally lost. Days where you feel disconnected from yourself, from others, even from God. Jeremiah's message whispers, it won't always be this way. God is still with you, even here. Another beautiful hidden truth comes later, when God speaks about a new covenant. The old covenant was written on stone tablets, external rules, external obedience. But the new covenant? God says, "I will write my law on their hearts." That means the relationship won't be based on rituals, but on connection. Not distance, closeness. Not fear, love. This prophecy points directly to Jesus, who would one day fulfill that new covenant with his own life. Jeremiah didn't know the details, but he knew something big was coming. Something more intimate. Something that would change everything. Here's something else that often goes unnoticed. Jeremiah suffered not because he was wrong, but because he was right. Sometimes obedience brings pain before it brings purpose. And maybe you felt that too. Doing the right thing doesn't always get you applause. Sometimes it gets you silence. Sometimes it gets you rejection. Sometimes it gets you loneliness. But Jeremiah's life tells you this. God sees what people don't. God rewards what others ignore. God honors what feels unnoticed. Jeremiah didn't live to see the full restoration of his people. He planted seeds he never got to watch grow. And that's another hidden message. Your obedience may bless someone long after you're gone. Your faithfulness might ripple into generations you'll never meet. Now, if you zoom out and look at Jeremiah's story as a whole, something beautiful appears. It's not a story of destruction. It's a story of return. It's a story of rebuilding. It's a story of relentless love. Jeremiah shows us a God who chases after his people even when they're busy running away. A God who cries when we break. A God who whispers hope in the middle of disaster. A God who says, "Come home. I'm not finished with you." The hidden message of Jeremiah is simple, soft, and deeply personal. You are not beyond God's reach. You are not too broken. You are not too late. And God's plans for you still stand, even when life falls apart. When you sit with this story long enough, you start realizing Jeremiah wasn't just speaking to ancient Israel. He's speaking to us. To anyone who's ever felt lost. To anyone who's ever felt tired. To anyone who's ever wondered if God still cares. And the answer woven through every page is this.
Yes.
He cares more than you know. There's a strange kind of beauty in stories that come from pain. They feel heavier, but somehow more real. That's exactly how the book of Jeremiah feels. It doesn't stand tall like a victory story. It doesn't sparkle with miracles like Elijah's stories. It doesn't roar with confidence like David's psalms. Instead, it feels like sitting with someone who has been through a lot, someone who still believes, but you can hear the fatigue in their voice. And honestly, that's what makes Jeremiah's story so powerful. Most people think they know what his book is about. Warnings, destruction, Babylon, exile. And sure, those things are there. But buried underneath all of that noise is something much softer, almost like a quiet heartbeat. A message that isn't loud, but once you hear it, you can't forget it. To find it, you have to see Jeremiah not as a prophet, but as a person. Imagine a young man who never wanted the spotlight, never wanted a public platform, never dreamed of shouting in the streets or confronting kings. He wasn't bold. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't looking for greatness. He was gentle, sensitive, emotional, someone who felt things deeply. And God chose him to carry one of the toughest messages in the Bible. It all begins with that moment, that unexpected, life-changing conversation between God and a teenager. God doesn't start with instructions. He starts with identity. Before I formed you, I knew you. That one line alone could heal a lot of hearts. The idea that God knows you fully, deeply, before you ever say yes or no, before you succeed or fail, before you even understand yourself. Jeremiah didn't feel ready. He said he was too young, too weak, too unsure. But God touched his mouth, gave him his words, and said, "Don't be afraid. I'm with you." And that's where everything begins. Not with confidence, but with companionship. Jeremiah steps into a world where truth is unwelcome. The nation looks successful from the outside, but spiritually it's breaking apart. Leaders are corrupt. Priests are fake. False prophets are spreading sweet lies. And people are comfortable in their disobedience. So Jeremiah becomes the voice no one wants to hear. He speaks truth even when it hurts. He speaks hope even when no one believes him. He speaks God's words even when they break his own heart. This is where the hidden message starts forming, not in his words, but in his life. Jeremiah teaches something most people never notice. It's possible to obey God and still feel alone. It's possible to be right and still be rejected. It's possible to carry truth and still carry pain. There's a chapter where Jeremiah cries out, "My heart is broken." He isn't crying because God is harsh. He's crying because the people he loves are running toward danger with their eyes closed. That kind of heartbreak feels familiar. Anyone who has watched someone drift away, emotionally, spiritually, personally, understands that pain. Jeremiah becomes a living expression of God's heart. His tears reflect God's tears. His grief reflects God's grief. His longing reflects God's longing. That's why he's called the weeping prophet. Not because he was weak, but because he loved too deeply to stay silent. One of the most powerful hidden moments in Jeremiah's story happens when God asks him to buy a field during a war. While Babylon is surrounding Jerusalem, while destruction is literally on the doorstep, while everyone is panicking, God tells Jeremiah to buy land. It makes no sense. Why buy property when your whole nation is about to fall? But that's the point. God was sending a message through Jeremiah's actions. This is not the end. One day, life will return. Homes will be rebuilt. Fields will be planted again. Hope is not loud here. It's a quiet seed buried in the soil of disaster. That's the hidden message. Hope doesn't always come wrapped in miracles. Sometimes it comes disguised as something ordinary. A small gesture, a simple act, a whisper instead of a shout. Another secret thread woven into Jeremiah's story is how personal God's love is. He isn't an angry judge in this book. He's a heartbroken husband watching his bride fall in love with worthless things. He isn't exploding with rage, he's aching with disappointment. There's a moment where God says, "I remember the love you had when you followed me in your youth." It's almost like reading a letter from someone remembering happier days. God isn't recalling their obedience, he's recalling their closeness. That's not judgment. That's longing. And when you read Jeremiah with open eyes, it becomes clear. God doesn't want to punish. He wants to restore. Even when Israel goes into exile, God's voice doesn't say, "I'm done with you." Instead, he says, "Build homes, plant gardens,
Get married.
have children. I still have a future for you." That's where the famous verse comes in, Jeremiah 29 verse 11. A promise given not to perfect people, not to obedient people, but to exiles who are facing consequences of their own choices. God tells them, "I know the plans I have for you. Not I hope,
Not maybe.
but I know." Even in judgment, God is planning restoration. Even in brokenness, God is crafting healing. That's the hidden message. God's promises are not canceled by your failures. Nobody says that out loud, but Jeremiah shows it again and again. Another overlooked truth appears when Jeremiah stands at the potter's house. He sees clay fail in the potter's hands, not because the clay is useless, but because it's still being shaped. Instead of throwing it away, the potter starts over. He presses, molds, reshapes, recreates. God leans close and says, "This is how I work with my people." It's one of the most comforting things in the Bible. Your mistakes don't ruin God's plan. They simply push him to reshape your future. Your broken places don't make you worthless. They make you moldable. Your weak moments don't disqualify you. They draw God closer. Jeremiah understood this deeply. He saw God's patience up close. He saw a God who refused to give up. Even when Jeremiah was thrown into a muddy pit to die, even when leaders silenced him, even when the nation mocked him, even when he felt like giving up completely, God kept telling him, "Don't be afraid. I'm with you." That's the part people miss. Jeremiah wasn't strong every day. He wanted to quit. He told God he felt pressured, overwhelmed, exhausted. And God didn't shame him for it. Instead, God reminded him that faithfulness isn't about feeling powerful, it's about staying close. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is simply not walk away. Jeremiah teaches us something the modern world forgets. Faithfulness and popularity rarely walk together. Obedience and applause rarely share the same space. Truth and comfort don't always hold hands. Jeremiah carried truth even when it cost him everything: his peace, his comfort, his friendships, his safety. But here's the twist. Jeremiah's message wasn't about destruction. It was about rebuilding. After all the warnings, after all the tears, after all the disasters, God ends the book by promising a new covenant, a deeper, more intimate relationship where his law would be written on hearts, not stone tablets. This prophecy points straight to Jesus, the one who would come centuries later and fulfill every promise Jeremiah spoke. So, what's the hidden message of Jeremiah? It's not judgment. It's not destruction. It's not hopelessness. It's this: even when you've gone too far, God is still reaching for you. Even when everything falls apart, God is already planning your restoration. Even when you feel forgotten, God is working behind the scenes. And even when you think it's the end, God is just turning the page. Jeremiah's story is the story of a God who refuses to walk away. A God who cries when you cry. A God who fights for your heart. A God who keeps loving even when you don't listen. A God who never stops planning your return. When you step out of this book, you don't leave with fear. You leave with hope. A quiet hope, but a steady one. The kind that wraps around your heart and reminds you, God isn't finished with you. Not today. Not ever. A nation that thought everything was fine. Imagine walking into a city that looks strong from the outside. Markets are busy. People are laughing. Leaders are giving speeches full of confidence. Everything seems stable. But Jeremiah could sense what no one else could. He felt the spiritual weight in the air, like the silence before a heavy rain. He saw how people talked about God, yet didn't listen to him. How they attended the temple, yet ignored his commandments. How they acted religious, but treated each other with cruelty, injustice, and dishonesty. Jeremiah would walk through the streets thinking, if only they could see what's coming. If only they could pause for one moment and hear what God is trying to say. But people didn't want to hear warnings. No one ever does. They wanted good news, easy news, comfortable news. So when Jeremiah spoke about repentance, people told him to stop ruining the mood. When he warned that Babylon was rising like a dark wave in the distance, they laughed. Jeremiah, relax. God is with us. Our city will never fall. They forgot that God's presence is not a shield for disobedience. And Jeremiah knew what they didn't. God wasn't abandoning them. They had already abandoned him. When comfort becomes a trap, there's something familiar about Israel's situation. Sometimes life feels predictable. You wake up, go to work, scroll through your phone, handle responsibilities, laugh with friends, and everything seems normal. You don't think disaster could come. You don't think you could lose anything. You don't think God might be warning you about something. But that's the dangerous part. Comfort makes you blind. Routine makes you slow. Pride makes you deaf. That's exactly how Judah was living, trapped in their own confidence. Jeremiah kept saying, "Look deeper. Things are not as okay as they look." But people brushed him aside. It's the same way we sometimes ignore the small signs in our own lives. A habit we know isn't good for us. A relationship pulling us away from God. A feeling of guilt we keep bearing. A prayer life that's slowly fading. A heart that feels colder than it used to. God warns us gently at first. Through discomfort. Through conviction. Through scripture. Through small moments that nudge the heart. But the people of Judah trained themselves not to notice. Jeremiah's heartbreak. Jeremiah wasn't a harsh preacher. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to prove he was right. He was heartbroken. The Bible calls him the weeping prophet. He didn't stand at the city gate shouting because he enjoyed it. He spoke because he loved his people. He pleaded because he knew what disobedience would cost. Sometimes he would go home after preaching and cry all night. He asked God, "Why won't they listen? Why is their heart so hard? Why am I carrying this burden alone?" Have you ever felt like that? You see someone heading toward disaster, a friend, a family member, and no matter how gently you warn them, they ignore you. They think your concern is negativity. They think your love is criticism. They think wisdom is fear. Jeremiah carried that pain for years. The turning point, when everything Jeremiah said came true. Then the morning came that no one expected. Babylon arrived, not like a rumor, not like a prophecy, but like a shadow covering the city. People started to panic. Leaders who once mocked Jeremiah were suddenly terrified. Families ran through the streets gathering what they could carry. The city shook under the sound of marching armies. And in that moment, someone must have whispered, "He warned us. Jeremiah warned us." But now it was too late. The walls that everyone believed were unbreakable started crumbling. The temple, the place they thought gave them automatic protection, didn't shield them at all. Their pride cracked. Their security shattered. Everything they trusted more than God collapsed in a single season. But even in judgment, God wasn't finished. Here's something beautiful. Even when God allowed judgment, he never let go of mercy. Judgment was not God's final word. It was the doorway to change. While the city burned, God's promise remained alive. "I will rebuild you. I will bring you back. I will give you a new heart." The warnings weren't punishment. They were rescue attempts. Sometimes God lets us walk through consequences not because he hates us, but because it's the only way to break what's breaking us. A wrong relationship ends painfully. A habit finally collapses. A dream shatters. A comfort zone disappears. And in the ruins, we hear a voice we couldn't hear before. Jeremiah's message was never just about destruction. It was about hope on the other side. The whisper you might be ignoring right now. Let's bring this to today, to you, to me, to every person still trying to navigate life. Sometimes God whispers warnings into your heart long before anything goes wrong. Maybe he's nudging you away from a certain path. Maybe he's telling you to forgive someone. Maybe he's asking you to stop hiding behind busyness. Maybe he's calling you back to prayer, not out of duty, but because you're drifting without realizing. We all have a Jeremiah moment, at least once in our lives. A moment where God says, "Slow down. Look inward. I'm trying to protect you." The question is, will we listen before the storm or after? A soft heart is a safe heart. Jeremiah teaches one powerful truth. A soft heart is the safest place a person can live. Judah had strong walls, strong leaders, strong traditions, but a hard heart. And that was enough to destroy everything. God isn't looking for perfection. He's looking for openness. A heart that says, "Lord, if I'm drifting, pull me back. If I'm wrong, correct me. If I'm blind, open my eyes." That kind of honesty can save a life. It can save a family. It can save a soul. The hope that survives every fire. Here's the part people often miss. After the nation fell, God didn't say, "This is the end." He said, "This is the beginning." He promised restoration. He promised healing. He promised a new covenant, one written not on stone tablets, but directly on the human heart. Meaning, God wasn't just fixing their circumstances. He was transforming their character. Jeremiah saw beyond the fire to the sunrise, beyond the ruins to the rebuilding, beyond the punishment to the mercy. He knew that judgment breaks things, but God heals better than judgment hurts. What this story means for you today. So, what does all of this mean for your life right now? Maybe you feel God tugging at your heart in some quiet way. Not loudly, not urgently, but gently, like a whisper. Maybe He's warning you about a path that will cost you peace, or calling you to release something that's draining your soul, or inviting you to return to Him more fully before life's noise drowns out your own heart. Jeremiah's story is not just ancient history. It's a mirror. It asks one simple question. Are you listening? Because God still speaks, still warns, still guides, still restores. And those who listen, truly listen, never face storms alone. Ending note for the viewer. If this story touched you, take a moment.
Breathe.
Let your heart soften a little. Ask God, what are you trying to tell me right now? You might be surprised by how clearly He answers. A God who speaks even when we stop listening. Judah had stopped paying attention to God a long time ago, but God never stopped speaking. That alone shows His love. Even when people turned away, He kept calling. Even when they ignored the prophets, He kept reaching. Even when they chose idols over Him, He still whispered, "Come back to me." Jeremiah carried that message like a flame cupped in both hands, trying to protect it from the wind. He knew people's hearts were hard, but he also knew God's love was even harder to silence. And the message God gave him wasn't angry. It was heartbreak. It was longing. It was hope. The beautiful image God uses. One of the most touching parts of Jeremiah is when God compares Himself to a loving father waiting at the door. He says, "Return, faithless people, for I am your Father." Jeremiah 3 verse 14. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine someone standing at the entrance of your home, not with anger or disappointment, but with open arms, with soft eyes, with a voice that sounds like, "I missed you." That's how God spoke to Judah, not with thunder, but with tenderness. It's the same way He speaks to us today. We sometimes expect God to yell when we wander, but He usually whispers, "Come back. You're safer with me." The deepest problem wasn't the idols, it was the distance. People in Jeremiah's time had idols everywhere, on hills, under trees, inside homes. But the real problem wasn't the statues. It was the distance those choices created. Idols weren't just objects. They were lifestyles. They were emotional replacements. They made people feel like they didn't need God, like they could control their own future, like they could bend blessings in their own direction. Does that sound familiar? Today our idols have new names. Status, validation, money, beauty, relationships, addiction, success, approval. Things that pull the heart little by little. We don't bow to statues. We bow to pressures. We bow to fears. We bow to the things we think will give us security. And then one day, the heart feels empty. That's when Jeremiah's message becomes personal. God wasn't saying, "Stop your idols because I'm angry." He was saying, "Your idols can't carry you. They can't love you. They can't protect you. They can't hear you. Come back to me. I can." Jeremiah knew this feeling firsthand. Jeremiah wasn't someone who preached from a comfortable place. His life was painful, lonely, and often misunderstood. He knew what it felt like to be abandoned. He knew what it felt like to cry without answers. He knew what it felt like to speak truth and be rejected for it. Maybe that's why he delivered God's message with such emotion. He wasn't just repeating words, he was living them. Sometimes God chooses messengers whose hearts already understand the ache. Jeremiah was one of them. He walked through life carrying the same longing God carried, a longing to see His people return. When God lets you feel the consequences. One of the hardest truths in Jeremiah is this. God allowed the nation to face consequences, not because He wanted to destroy them, but because that was the only way to break their stubbornness. Sometimes in life, the only thing that wakes us up is loss. Not because God is cruel, but because pain clears the noise. It makes you see what you couldn't see before. It brings the heart to a place where it finally says, God, I miss you. Judah had to feel the weight of their choices. Babylon's attack wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Everything they trusted instead of God collapsed. And in the ruins, their hearts softened. Sometimes God lets things fall apart so our hearts can fall back into His hands. A promise that survived the ruins. Here is the grace hidden inside Jeremiah's story. Even after the nation fell, even after they lost everything, God still said, My love for you hasn't changed. He promised them restoration. I will bring you back to your land. I will give you shepherds after my own heart. I will write my law inside you. Jeremiah 3:31. It's stunning. The people broke their side of the covenant countless times, but God never broke His. Judgment was temporary. Love was permanent. He didn't just want to fix their behavior. He wanted to heal their hearts. That's the real theme of Jeremiah. God wants your heart more than your rituals. When God's voice finds you in your quiet moments. Jeremiah paints a picture of how God speaks when life finally slows down. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's that soft moment when something inside you whispers, You can't keep living like this.
Or,
You know where real peace is, go back there.
Or,
You've been carrying this alone for too long. Everybody has a moment like that. A moment when God's voice feels less like a command and more like an invitation. That's the moment Judah faced, and the moment many people face today. God's love is not fragile, it waits. One of the most beautiful lines God says through Jeremiah is, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Jeremiah 30:1-3. Everlasting. Meaning, it doesn't fade. It doesn't break. It doesn't expire. Even when Judah ran from Him, God kept the door open. He didn't change the locks. He didn't shut off the light. He didn't move on. He waited. In the same way, God waits for us. Even when we take wrong turns. Even when we hide behind guilt or shame. Even when we feel unworthy. His love doesn't get tired. A new covenant. A new kind of relationship. Jeremiah revealed something revolutionary. Something that would change the whole future of faith. God promised a new covenant. Not one written on stone, but written directly on the heart. Meaning, relationship over rules, love over law, connection over religious routine. God wasn't interested in empty rituals. He wanted closeness. He wanted intimacy. He wanted people to walk with Him, not just worship Him from a distance. This prophecy pointed forward to Jesus, the one who would make that new covenant possible. Jeremiah saw it from far away, like a sunrise on the horizon. A message for anyone who feels far from God. Let's bring this into the present, to the person watching your video, sitting alone with their phone or laptop, feeling a strange tug in their chest. Maybe they feel far from God. Maybe life has been loud, messy, or heavy. Maybe they've drifted without meaning to. Maybe they've made mistakes that left wounds they don't know how to heal. Jeremiah's message is simple. You are never too far to return. God doesn't say, fix yourself first. He says, come home. The door is open. The Father is waiting. Mercy is still warm. Grace is still alive. No matter how many steps you've taken away, it only takes one step to come back. If you're listening, it's not too late. Jeremiah's generation waited until everything collapsed. Don't make that your story. If you're feeling a small pull inside, even a tiny one, that's God speaking. That's His invitation. That's His hand on your shoulder. He's not pushing you. He's guiding you.
Gently.
Lovingly. Because He wants you close again. Final words for the viewer. If you're watching this and something inside you feels warm or peaceful or emotional, don't ignore it. That's God reminding you who you truly are. Talk to Him, even if it's messy, even if you don't know where to start. Just say, God, I want to come home. And He will meet you right there, not with judgment, but with joy. There's a moment in every person's life where something breaks.
Sometimes it's a plan.
Sometimes it's a relationship. Sometimes it's your confidence, your trust, or your sense of direction. And in that fragile space, the space most of us hate, God often speaks the loudest. Jeremiah understood that better than anyone. His whole life was a lesson in how God uses broken moments to guide people back to truth. This episode is about that kind of moment, the kind where your heart feels cracked, but something inside you whispers, this break might be the beginning of something better. Jeremiah was sent to a people who pretended everything was okay. Judah had become a nation of actors. Everyone said the right things. Everyone followed the rituals. Everyone looked religious from a distance. But inside, there were cracks. People were dishonest with each other. Leaders were corrupt. Prophets were preaching comforting lies. And worship had become a performance, not a relationship. Imagine a vase that looks beautiful until you hold it up to the light, and suddenly you see thin cracks running through it. That was Judah, shiny on the outside, breaking on the inside. Jeremiah's mission was not to expose them in anger, but to help them see the truth before it shattered completely. A visit to the potter's house. God explains it all. One of the most powerful moments in Jeremiah's story happened when God told him to go watch a potter at work. Jeremiah walked into that workshop, watching a man spin clay on a wheel. The potter shaped the clay, pressed it, stretched it, and then suddenly, the pot collapsed in his hands. It wasn't ruined. It wasn't thrown away. It was simply reshaped. The potter didn't get frustrated. He didn't give up. He just started over. And God whispered to Jeremiah, "This is what I do with my people." What a tender image. A God who doesn't throw you away when you break, but reshapes you gently with his own hands. Everything you've lost, everything that cracked, everything that didn't go the way you hoped,
None of it is the end.
it's God shaping you. But Judah didn't want to be reshaped. The tragedy wasn't that Judah failed. Everyone fails. The tragedy was that Judah refused to change. They wanted blessings without obedience. They wanted security without sacrifice. They wanted God's protection without God's presence. Jeremiah kept pleading, "Let God reshape you before you break." But the people said,
No.
"We will follow our own plans." It's painful how familiar those words feel. Every human heart has moments like that, moments where pride whispers louder than wisdom. We think we know better. We think we can fix things alone. We think surrender is too hard. And slowly, cracks appear. The broken jar, a warning that hurt Jeremiah too. There's another moment in Jeremiah's story that cuts deep. God told him to buy a clay jar, a thick, expensive one, and take it to the valley where people once sacrificed to idols. Then, in front of the leaders, God told him to smash it. The sound echoed like thunder. Pieces scattered everywhere. Fragments rolled across the ground. And God said, "This is what will happen to this nation if they don't turn back." That must have hurt Jeremiah. He loved his people too much to enjoy any part of that message. But he also knew something many forget. Brokenness is not meant to destroy you. It's meant to wake you up. Sometimes the only way God gets your attention is by breaking the things that were slowly breaking you. Jeremiah's loneliness, a side of his story nobody talks about. We often picture Jeremiah as strong and brave, but he was also deeply human. He felt lonely. He felt misunderstood. He felt rejected by the very people he was trying to save. There were nights he cried until sleep found him. Days where he felt like God gave him a burden too heavy for one person to carry. Moments where he asked God, "Why me? Why this life? Why this pain?" You can feel the weight in his words. This wasn't a prophet shouting in the streets for attention. This was a man breaking on the inside, yet still standing because God asked him to. Jeremiah's heartbreak teaches a simple truth. Even when you are breaking, God can still use you to heal others. Then the storm finally came. Judah didn't listen. Warnings were ignored. Mercy was wasted. And finally, Babylon came. The morning it happened must have been terrifying. The sound of marching armies. The sky dimming under a cloud of dust. People running. Cries echoing through the streets. The walls of Jerusalem trembling. the temple, the pride of the nation, shaking like a dying heartbeat. Everything Jeremiah said came true, but he wasn't celebrating. He wasn't saying, "I told you so." He was weeping. The city was falling, but so was Jeremiah's heart. Brokenness everywhere. Homes destroyed. Families separated. Dreams turned to ashes. Yet even there, in the smoke and ruin, God's whisper didn't disappear. God still spoke, even in the ruins. This is the part that surprises people. You'd think God would be silent. You'd think he'd say, "I warned you. Now endure the consequences." But instead, he said, "I will bring you back. I will rebuild you. I will restore your hope. I will write my law on your hearts." It's breathtaking. The same God who allowed the nation to break was the same God promising to heal it. It reminds you of a simple truth. God doesn't break you to harm you. He breaks what was harming you, not to destroy your future, but to shape a new one. Where this story meets your life, let's step away from ancient ruins and look at your life right now, in this moment. Maybe something broke recently. Maybe a relationship ended. Maybe trust was shattered. Maybe a dream fell apart. Maybe your heart feels tired. Or maybe you're quietly carrying sadness you never talk about. And deep down you wonder, why is this happening? Why is everything so heavy? Jeremiah's story gives you an answer. Sometimes God lets things break, so you can finally see what wasn't working. Sometimes he removes things you were never meant to depend on. Sometimes he shakes your world to wake your soul, not because he's angry, but because he wants you whole. The message God sends through broken places. If you listen closely, broken moments often carry the same message God gave Judah. Come back to me. Let me reshape you. Let me rebuild you. Let me give you something better.
There's tenderness in that.
Not force, not guilt, just an invitation, an open door, a steady hand, a father waiting at the edge of the path, hoping you'll turn back. Jeremiah's hope, the part most people forget. Jeremiah is known as the prophet of warnings, but he's also the prophet of hope.
He saw disaster, yes.
But he also saw restoration beyond imagination. He saw a future where people would know God personally, where forgiveness would be deeper than failure, where grace would reach places laws never could, where broken hearts would become God-shaped hearts. Jeremiah carried both messages, the warning and the hope, because that's how God works. He warns to protect. He breaks to rebuild. He tears down what destroys you, so he can plant something that gives life. The ending message, straight from Jeremiah's heart to yours. If you feel like your life is cracked, or you've drifted, or you're tired of pretending everything is fine, hear this gently. You're not too far gone. You're not too broken. You're not too late. God isn't finished with you. He never was. Your story can still be reshaped. Your heart can still be healed. Your future can still bloom again. Just like the potter, God hasn't thrown you away.
He's holding you,
reshaping you, softening you, protecting you from yourself, guiding you back to where you were always meant to be. All you have to say is, "God, I'm ready. Make me new." That one sentence can shift everything. A people who forgot their own heart. Judah had become skilled at pretending. They looked faithful. They looked religious. They looked safe. But deep inside, something had gone wrong. Their hearts were far from God. Their priorities were scattered. Their choices had led them into patterns they couldn't see clearly. Jeremiah watched it all with a heavy heart. He saw them repeating mistakes they had been warned about for years. He saw their pride blinding them. He saw their comfort turning into chains. And God spoke to Jeremiah. "You must tell them the truth, even if they won't listen." It wasn't a message of hate. It wasn't a message of anger. It was a message of love. When truth is hard to speak. Have you ever had to tell someone something important, something they didn't want to hear? That's Jeremiah's life. He spoke truth when no one wanted it. He warned, pleaded, and cried. He confronted leaders, prophets, and ordinary people. He carried the weight of God's voice, even when it made him lonely. Imagine the courage that takes. not the courage to fight or conquer, but the courage to speak honestly, even when it breaks your own heart. Jeremiah shows us that love sometimes looks like discomfort. Sometimes faithfulness hurts, especially when you care too much to stay silent. The broken covenant. Judah had made promises to God. They had agreed to follow him. They had agreed to live by his ways. But promises were easy to make. Living them was hard. Idols took their attention. Comfort distracted them. Leaders misled them. And slowly, their covenant with God cracked. Jeremiah saw it, and God allowed him to watch. Not as punishment, but as a lesson. He wanted his people to see the cost of drifting away. Sometimes God allows us to witness the consequences of our choices, so we can finally wake up. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we have to experience before we understand them. God's patience through all of it. Even though Judah ignored repeated warnings, God didn't abandon them. That's the part many miss. Judgment came eventually, yes. Babylon's army did arrive. Walls fell. Families were scattered. But even in the destruction, God's patience never ran out. He didn't say, "I'm done with you." He said, "I'm still with you. Come back." There's something profoundly comforting in that. Even when we run from God, even when we fail him, even when our mistakes pile up, he waits, not with anger, not with disappointment alone, but with an open heart, the image of a faithful shepherd. Jeremiah used many images to communicate God's heart. One of the most striking is the shepherd. A shepherd doesn't abandon the sheep when it strays. He doesn't yell or shame. He searches, calls, and guides it back.
God is the same.
He follows us patiently, quietly, lovingly, even when we wander far into darkness. Jeremiah's words remind us that God isn't just a distant observer. He's a shepherd who personally cares about every lost soul, the beauty of a heart that returns. One of the greatest messages hidden in Jeremiah is this: it doesn't matter how far you've drifted. It doesn't matter how broken your choices have made you feel. It doesn't matter how long you've ignored God. Your heart can return, and God rejoices when it does. He doesn't treat your return as a failure for being lost. He celebrates your choice to come home. He welcomes you like a parent waiting for a child who's been away. This is the heart of God that Jeremiah wanted everyone to see. Not judgment alone, but restoration. Not punishment alone, but healing. Not absence, but presence. Lessons from Jeremiah for our lives today. Jeremiah's story is ancient, but the lessons are timeless. Listen early. God whispers before storms come. Don't wait until life collapses to hear him. Trust his patience. Even if you feel far, God is still with you. He hasn't given up. Love in truth. Jeremiah shows us that loving someone sometimes means telling hard truths, even if it costs us. Embrace restoration. God's ultimate goal isn't punishment. It's to heal hearts and guide lives. When you feel abandoned, it's natural to feel abandoned sometimes. By friends, by family, by your own strength. But Jeremiah reminds us, you are never abandoned by God. Even in exile, even in pain, even when everything seems lost, he waits for your return. He waits for your heart to open. He waits to remind you that restoration is possible. Your failures are not bigger than his love. Your mistakes are not too deep for his patience. Your drift is never too far for his arms to reach. The promise that changes everything. The hidden message of Jeremiah shines brightest in one promise. I will write my law on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Jeremiah 30:1 verse 33. God isn't content with mere rules or rituals. He wants transformation. He wants intimacy. He wants connection that no one can take away. Even when we fail, even when the world seems dark, even when we feel unworthy, God's heart is ready to guide us back. Your turn to listen. As you reflect on Jeremiah's story, ask yourself, where have I drifted? What am I clinging to that God wants me to let go of? How can I return to him today in a small but meaningful way? Jeremiah's story is an invitation, not a warning alone. It whispers to the heart, You are never too lost to return. I am here. I am waiting. Let me guide you home. Final words. God's love is patient. His heart is tender. His arms are always open. Jeremiah reminds us that even in judgment, there is hope. Even in exile, there is restoration. Even in brokenness, there is a God who never stops waiting. All we have to do is listen, turn, and walk back to Him.